Our scripture lesson this morning comes from Matthew's Gospel, and I will be reading from the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 16. This is the story of the laborers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into the vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the regular daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. My growing up years, at least physically, were spent in rural North Carolina on a tobacco farm. Many of you know that. And say what you will about tobacco and the dangers of its use. I probably won't disagree with you, but I'm aware that tobacco farming and manufacture was the leading employer in North Carolina when I was coming along. Things have changed mightily. I was curious as I was writing this. So I looked up the largest employers in North Carolina, and tobacco was nowhere to be seen in the top 10. R.J. Reynolds and P. Lorillard tobacco companies ruled the roost when I was coming up. If you didn't grow tobacco, you worked in a tobacco factory, or you had a support role such as administration or research. But these days, it seems that North Carolina is now a place of banking and education. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is now the largest employer in the state, with Wake Forest and Duke universities also making the top 10 list. I can in no way argue that the way it was 30 years or so ago is better. It was just different. I was thinking about my time on the tobacco farm because I found myself relating to the day laborers in the scripture reading. Thankfully, since I've been an adult, I have not had to rely on day labor for my income. There were people working along with me in the tobacco fields who did, though. The uncertainty of day labor would be stressful. Not knowing from one day to the next if you would have work or how much work you might have would be a hard way to live. I remember as a child and a teen, I would wake up excited on a summer morning during tobacco season when I would hear the rain falling outside my window. Those raindrops meant that I could roll over and go back to sleep. We wouldn't be working in the fields on the rainy day. The tobacco wouldn't cure properly if it was wet. I wasn't worried about the money I wouldn't make that day. I was living with my parents, and the money I made in the fields was mostly mine to spend. I didn't have to worry about my food or my clothes. I was taken care of, whether we worked on a particular day or not. I enjoyed the money, mind you, but I didn't depend on that money for my survival. About the time I went to college, migrant farm workers started to enter into our region. And these men were there to work in order to support their families. If they didn't work, they might not have food or other necessities. And I remember well riding with the farm owner I worked with to pick up migrant farm workers. They usually stayed in some little house a farmer had on his land. There would be several people living in one small house. The farmer would pull up into the driveway, and usually someone met us there. The farmer would request the number of workers he needed for the day, and that main guy would then communicate this to the others. Now, we didn't see the people who were in the house until they were hired, and then we only saw the men who were coming to work with us. They would climb into the back of the pickup, and off we would go to the tobacco field. I didn't know at the time what I was participating in. I was a child, and I had no say. But of course, now I know that these men were from Mexico, were in the country illegally. They came seasonally to North Carolina and other such states to work in the farms to be able to send money back to their families. And when the farm season was over, the Mexican people disappeared from our area until the next year. Now, we could debate the legalities of the situation. We could talk about the plight of the migrant farm worker. We could even discuss injustices present herein. But that's not what I'm focusing on today, though. This was simply the world in which I grew up. I was a farm girl, and farmers did what they could do to eke out a living from the land. At times, finding people to work in the dirt and the muck of the tobacco fields was difficult. I remember fondly the trips to pick up the migrant workers, because in my mind, the presence of these workers made my day shorter. I'm coming off as pretty lazy, aren't I? But working in the tobacco field was not, my most exciting goal. But anyway, the routine was that when there were migrant workers available, they worked in the field, and I got to go to the barn. The work was hard in both places, but the barn gave us shelter and a slightly slower pace of work. You also got to stand upright. When you're priming tobacco, you're bending over, pulling the bottom leaves off the tobacco plant. So it was a little easier at the barn. So for me, Matthew 20 is a true-to-life parable. Day laborers were readily available in Jesus' day, and they're readily available today if you know where to look. I don't think the laborers in the vineyard were wrong in their protest. It does seem fair that those who worked a full day would make more than those who only worked a partial day. I think it's particularly resonant in our minds since we are accustomed to being paid on an hourly rate. The laborer's complaint seems reasonable, even if misguided. Why wouldn't those who worked less get paid less? Yet, it's important to note that everyone in the story got paid at the rate at which they were hired. I'm reminded of sitting around my farmer's front yard after a long day of work. All the workers would wash our hands, get a soda and maybe a snack, while the farmer and his wife figured out our pay and wrote checks for the day. Now, this couple was very wise, I think, for they never discussed in our presence what anyone made. I was aware, as one of the youngest workers on the farm, that my hourly wage was less than some of the more experienced workers, but it never occurred to me to challenge that. However, now that I read the story again and think about it, I wonder what those different agreements among the different workers on the farm were. There had to be differences. It seems only right that a man working to feed his family would make more than a 12-year-old girl. We never talked about the wages, though. So I asked the question, why does it matter so much what someone else was paid, as long as we were paid what we were hired to be paid? It seems to me one way that is sure to make me unhappy is to compare what I have or what I don't have to what someone else has. I'm very happy with my life. I make a good living. I have a job I love and great people to work with. Just look at yourselves. I'm content. I have the things I need and many of the things I want. That's enough. I will admit to being a human. I am as human as the rest of you. And when I go to Presbytery, usually in the spring, and we are given the clergy compensation report, which looks at each pastor in the presbytery and what that person is paid. It's an effort to keep things honest and to keep things equitable. And salaries of pastors are public knowledge. So anyway, it's reported to Presbytery. But it's easy to take that sheet of paper and look at the pastors who have a larger salary, or those who may have perks written into their terms of call that I might not. What is it about our human brains that we compare ourselves to those who are doing better than we are? Truth be told, there are probably way more pastors and certainly lay pastors in this presbytery who make less than I do. However, I don't spend as much time looking at those situations. I tend to be looking at the ones who have a better deal than I do, or so I think. I'm human, How often do we compare ourselves to those who are less advantaged than we are? That might lead us to experience feelings of gratitude in our situation. Do I allow myself to feel compassion for the family of 4 who's living on less than my salary of a single person? Admittedly, not as often. We are quicker to focus on those who have more than we do. We have a hard time liking that others have more than we do. Be honest, I'm not talking in words you don't understand. Jealousy, envy, even greed rear their ugly heads all too often. It's easy to identify with the laborers in this parable. I get it. I think you get it too, even if you didn't grow up working on a farm. As I said, my friends and I never knew what anyone else made on the farm. But I can assure you, if I knew I were paid the same amount you were paid, and I worked twice as long as you worked, I would have felt slighted. Never mind that I was paid exactly what I agreed to work for when I was hired. That wouldn't have mattered as much as the fact that you worked less than I did and you got paid more than me. That's a recipe for jealousy and envy. The parable Jesus shares with us in Matthew 20 is entitled in my Bible, The Laborers in the Vineyard. And it sets the story up such that we are in alliance with the laborers. We can understand and perhaps feel in our gut our reaction of those laborers who worked the entire day. I want to propose a question, though. What if the parable were entitled The Generous Landowner? Would we read it differently? In verse 15, after the laborers have had their say, the landowner asks this question: "Are you envious because I am generous?" Well, that question changes everything in my mind. I read the parable from the perspective of the complaining laborers. It's usually pretty easy to get caught up in complaining with others, whatever the topic may be. I'm convinced that complaining is contagious. Have you noticed? Sit down beside someone who is disgruntled, a person who's complaining, And 9 times out of 10, you will catch yourself complaining by the end of the conversation. At the very least, you will come away from that conversation less content than you were before you shared the conversation of complaining. You may not have even known you had a complaint, but if you aren't careful, you'll find yourself complaining about something, and there goes your happy mood. Think about it. Not only does complaining and comparing yourselves to others make you unhappy, it impacts the mood of those around you. So put yourself in the place of the landowner in this parable. It's important to note that in the first century, and really any century, the landowner could in fact choose to do what he pleased with his resources. That's pretty simple, right? This particular landowner had a different concept of fairness than did his laborers. Within Jesus' parables, when you have a landowner, the landowner was usually a portrait of one who made wise decisions. That makes sense because the landowner in most parables represents God. So put yourself in the place of the landowner, the place of God. You hired a batch of laborers first thing in the morning, and you promised to pay them a day's wage. Well, as the day progressed, you realized you could use a few more laborers. So you went and hired a few more laborers. You hired them for the rest of the day. And even later into the day, you realized we could use some more people. I know when I was working in the tobacco field, I was always happy when another worker would walk into the field. That meant we would finish sooner. That meant there was one less row of tobacco I had to prime. No one complained as laborers were added to accomplish the work at hand. Now that changed when it came time to settle the accounts for the day, at least in the parable. Now maybe the landowner made a mistake when he directed the manager to pay the laborers who came last first. If he had paid those who worked the longest first, they would have gotten their checks or their coins or whatever method was used to be paid in those days. They would have gotten their pay first and maybe went on their way, none the wiser. And everyone, they would have assumed that everyone just got paid the same. Or the landowner could have been like the farmer I worked for, and he kept the pay quiet. But then again, maybe the landowner knew exactly what he was doing. By setting things up in this manner, we are given a teachable moment. And remember, the landowner is God, so of course it was all by design. The landowner's response to the grumbling laborers gets my attention. Are you envious because I'm generous? Can you imagine being the laborer who hears these words? The landowner was being generous. But we make it all about us, and we get upset that we were paid exactly what we were promised. Can't you just hear yourself grumbling something like, I worked all day and I only got a day's wage? Joe over here worked half a day and he got a day's wage. I should get twice as much as he got. I get it, I do. But in reality, it's not a valid argument. They were paid what the landowner promised them. The laborers should have been content. And I think they would have been content if they had not compared each other to each other. That's where the problem came for the laborers who worked all day. Now, I don't think generosity ever crossed their minds. We have a quid pro quo mentality. We don't even know how to respond to true generosity. We relegate it to equality or accountability, and in the end, we deconstruct generosity. Simple generosity. The landowner was being nice. Perhaps he was paying what he wanted to pay, rather than being bound by only paying what people deserved. And when you put it like that, it sounds a little bit like grace to me. Generosity, like grace, does not demand a response. God is about unreckonable grace. Grace, by definition, is God's unmerited favor. It is kindness from God that we don't deserve. There's nothing we have done or that we can ever do to earn this favor. It's a gift from God. We probably aren't capable of living out generosity in its truest form. Yet we know and we experience these realities. We know the need to receive generosity and the need to extend generosity. I think we have the desire to be generous and for generosity. But this desire comes from the depths of our soul, where we know God, where we truly know God. So even if the generosity idea is fleeting, I encourage you to extend generosity to others. Don't do it for yourself, but for those who might get to see a glimpse of God's nature through our generosity. And I pray that as you extend generosity, you will receive a glimpse of God at work as well. Amen.